The lake had always been the quiet kind of beautiful. The kind that didn't need noise to feel alive. Early that morning, the water sat smooth and reflective, broken only by gentle ripples from a passing breeze. It was the kind of place people dreamed of for weddings, retreats, or simply escaping the chaos of everyday life. For me, it wasn't just a dream location. It was home. It was family history. And most importantly, it was legally, unquestionably mine. The wedding preparations had been planned carefully and privately. This wasn't a loud, flashy event meant to disrupt anyone's peace. It was meant to be intimate, tasteful, and respectful of the surrounding community. Every vendor had been instructed to keep noise minimal. Decorations were designed to blend into the natural environment. Parking plans were arranged to avoid blocking any roads. Everything was done by the book, even though technically, it didn't have to be. The lakefront property had been in my family for years. Long before the surrounding neighborhood turned into a tightly controlled HOA community, this land existed independently. Over time, houses crept closer, fences went up, and signs about rules and regulations appeared. Eventually, the HOA expanded its influence over most nearby homes. But the lake property remained separate, protected by older deeds, clear boundaries, and legal documentation that predated the HOA entirely. That detail, however, wasn't widely known among the newer residents. To most people driving past, the lake looked like part of the neighborhood. It appeared shared. Open. Almost public. The HOA had leaned into that illusion for years, benefiting from the aesthetic without actually owning a single inch of it. They referenced it vaguely in newsletters, used it in promotional materials, and allowed residents to assume it fell under HOA authority. That assumption would become the foundation of a major mistake. As wedding day approached, subtle signs of tension began to surface. A few unfamiliar cars slowed down near the entrance. Someone was seen taking photos from a distance. A couple of residents lingered longer than usual near the property line, watching preparations with thinly disguised judgment. Still, no one said anything directly. No letters. No official notices. No warnings. That silence was deceptive. Behind the scenes, word had already reached the HOA board. An event. A gathering. A wedding. On their lake. For someone like the HOA board president, this was unacceptable. She was the kind of person who treated HOA bylaws like personal commandments. Every rule was absolute. Every infraction was an opportunity for control. She had built her reputation on enforcement, fines, and intimidation. Residents feared her knock on the door. Contractors avoided her street. Even fellow board members rarely challenged her. To her, authority mattered more than accuracy. The moment she heard about the wedding, she assumed it was unauthorized. In her mind, no one could host an event near the lake without HOA approval. Permits, fees, restrictions, she believed they all applied automatically. She didn't verify ownership. She didn't check records. She didn't ask questions. She acted. The first move was predictable. Internal HOA emails. Complaints framed as concerns. Noise violations that hadn't happened yet. Parking issues that were hypothetical. Environmental impact claims with no evidence. By the time the wedding morning arrived, she was already convinced she was stopping a major rule-breaking incident. Meanwhile, the lake remained calm. Guests began arriving quietly, guided by staff who ensured everything ran smoothly. Decorations caught the sunlight without overwhelming the natural scenery. Chairs were arranged carefully, facing the water. There was no music blasting. No crowd spilling into the neighborhood. Everything unfolded exactly as planned. From a distance, the HOA president watched. What she saw wasn't chaos. It wasn't disorder. It was something worse in her eyes, something happening without her permission. That was when she escalated. Rather than contacting the property owner, rather than seeking clarification, she made a call that would change the entire day. A call rooted in confidence, not correctness. A call based on authority she believed she had, but never actually did. As emergency vehicles began making their way toward the lake, the atmosphere shifted. The peaceful setting suddenly felt tense, uncertain. Guests noticed movement beyond the trees. Staff exchanged concerned glances. The ceremony had not yet begun, but the disruption was already in motion. The HOA president stood firm, convinced she was about to prove her power in front of an entire audience. What she didn't know was that every document, every boundary marker, and every legal right was about to come into play. The lake she thought she controlled was never hers. The rules she tried to enforce had no reach here. And the decision she just made would expose more than just her misunderstanding. As the sound of approaching sirens echoed faintly across the water, the truth stood quietly in the background, waiting to surface. And when it did, nothing would go the way she expected. The arrival of law enforcement changed the energy instantly. What had moments earlier been a peaceful lakeside setting now carried an undercurrent of tension that no decoration could hide. Guests tried to remain calm, assuming it was a misunderstanding that would be resolved quickly. After all, nothing about the event felt illegal, disruptive, or reckless. Everything had been planned with intention and restraint. From the HOA president's perspective, this was her moment. She stood confidently near the edge of the gathering, already framing the story in her head. An unauthorized event. HOA rules violated. A board member stepping in to protect community standards. She expected compliance, apologies, maybe even embarrassment from the property owner once the truth, as she imagined it, came out. But reality had a very different plan. Law enforcement didn't arrive aggressively. They assessed first. They observed the scene. A quiet wedding setup. No blocked roads. No excessive noise. No visible disturbance to the surrounding neighborhood. That alone began to chip away at the certainty the HOA president carried so loudly. Still, she persisted. She presented herself as the authority figure she believed she was. She insisted the event violated HOA regulations. She emphasized the lake's importance to the community. She spoke with confidence, using phrases about shared property, community oversight, and enforcement rights. To her, this wasn't a debate. It was a correction. What she hadn't prepared for was documentation. Ownership records don't argue. Deeds don't get emotional. Boundaries don't bend to assumptions. As law enforcement reviewed the information provided by the property owner, the situation began to shift. The lakefront land wasn't just privately owned, it was independently registered, clearly separated from HOA jurisdiction, and legally protected. The HOA had no authority there. Never had. Never would. The realization didn't hit all at once. It came in pieces. First, confusion. Then, clarification. Then, silence. The HOA president's confident posture stiffened. Her tone changed. She repeated herself, hoping volume might replace validity. But each repetition only reinforced the same conclusion. Her authority stopped at the property line, and she had crossed it. What made the situation worse was her decision to involve emergency services without verification. The call itself was legal, but the reason behind it was now under scrutiny. This wasn't an urgent situation. It wasn't a public safety issue. It was a private event on private land. Her attempt to exert control had backfired. Guests watched from a distance as the conversation continued. Whispers spread quietly through the crowd. What had started as concern turned into disbelief. Then curiosity. Then quiet satisfaction. The wedding hadn't been interrupted because of wrongdoing. It had been interrupted because someone assumed power where none existed. The HOA president, meanwhile, found herself cornered by facts. She tried shifting blame. She implied misinformation. She referenced HOA understandings and long-standing practices. None of it mattered. Informal assumptions don't override recorded ownership. Community perception doesn't cancel legal boundaries. The officers made it clear. The event could continue. The property owner was within their rights. The HOA had no standing. That should have been the end of it. But people like her rarely stop when proven wrong. Instead of stepping back, she doubled down emotionally. Her frustration became visible. The control she relied on had slipped away in front of witnesses, and that humiliation cut deeper than any fine ever could. Years of enforcing rules had conditioned her to expect obedience. Resistance wasn't just unexpected, it was unacceptable. Still, she had no move left. As law enforcement prepared to leave, the setting slowly returned to calm. The lake resumed its quiet rhythm. Decorations fluttered lightly in the breeze again. Guests relaxed, reassured that the ceremony would go on. What should have been a disruption instead became a moment of clarity. But the consequences were only beginning. The HOA president didn't leave quietly. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge her mistake. Instead, she walked away already planning her next move. Emails would be sent. Complaints would be filed. The board would hear about this. She wasn't done, even if the law clearly was. What she failed to understand was that her actions had now created a record. A documented misuse of authority. A false claim of jurisdiction. A public attempt to control private property. Those things don't disappear once exposed. As the ceremony preparations resumed, the property owner stood grounded, not shaken. There was no panic, no regret. Just patience. The truth had done its job quietly, exactly as it always does. And now, it was waiting to do more. Because the HOA president hadn't just interrupted a wedding. She had challenged ownership she didn't understand, authority she didn't have, and someone who was fully prepared to defend both. And in the final chapter, that mistake would come back to her in ways she never anticipated. By the time the ceremony finally began, the disruption had already turned into something else entirely. What was meant to be a quiet wedding had become a moment of exposure, one that revealed far more than anyone expected. The lake, unchanged and indifferent, reflected the scene with the same calm it always had. It had seen decades pass, boundaries shift, and people come and go. Authority, it seemed, was temporary. Ownership was not. The wedding itself unfolded exactly as planned. The interruption didn't steal the moment. If anything, it sharpened it. Guests were more present, more aware of the setting and its significance. The vows, the stillness, the shared understanding that something had almost been taken away, all of it made the celebration feel earned rather than interrupted. But while the celebration moved forward, the consequences were already moving behind the scenes. The HOA board could not ignore what had happened. Emergency services had been called under false assumptions. Jurisdiction had been challenged and disproven. And witnesses, plenty of them, had seen the board president act without verification, without restraint, and without legal footing. What she had framed as enforcement now looked like overreach. Records were requested. Emails surfaced. Internal messages revealed how quickly she had acted without checking ownership. The lake had always been a gray area in HOA discussions, spoken about vaguely, never formally claimed. That vagueness had finally caught up with her. For the first time, the HOA faced a problem it couldn't find a way. Legal advisors reviewed the situation carefully. The conclusion was unavoidable. The HOA had no authority over the lakefront property. Any attempt to regulate, restrict, or represent it as community-owned had no legal basis. Worse, the board president's actions exposed the association to potential liability. The story spread quickly through the neighborhood. Residents who had long feared enforcement began asking questions. How many other rules had been enforced without proper authority? How often had assumptions replaced facts? The lake incident became a reference point, not just about a wedding, but about power used carelessly. Pressure built quietly but steadily. The board president found herself isolated. Support thinned. Confidence evaporated. What once worked, intimidation, certainty, aggressive enforcement, now only reminded people of what had gone wrong. Her reputation shifted from strict but effective to reckless and unverified. Eventually, consequences arrived in a form she couldn't dismiss. The HOA was forced to formally acknowledge the lake's true ownership. Official documents were corrected. References to the lake were removed from HOA materials. Boundaries were clarified and recorded. The illusion of control was erased permanently, replaced by facts that could no longer be ignored. As for the board president, her position became untenable. Whether by resignation or removal, her authority ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with quiet finality. Power built on assumption rarely survives exposure. The neighborhood changed after that. Residents became more informed. More cautious. More willing to question. The HOA shifted from aggressive enforcement to measured governance, aware now of the cost of overstepping. The lake, once a symbol of unspoken control, became a reminder of the limits of authority. And the wedding? It became a story told with laughter and perspective. What began as an attempt to shut it down turned into proof of something far more lasting, that ownership matters, documentation matters, and confidence without truth eventually collapses. The lake remained exactly as it had always been. Calm. Private. Unbothered by titles or committees. It didn't need enforcement. It needed respect. And in the end, respect returned to where it belonged. Not to the HOA. Not to assumed power. But to the land itself, and to the people who truly owned it.